She was 31 years old when the world last saw her alive. Her name was Harper Linwood, a soft-spoken medical billing clerk from a small town outside Knoxville, Tennessee. People who remembered her would describe the same thing every time. They would say Harper walked through life like she was always listening for something. Quiet, observant, polite. The kind of woman who carried too much on her own shoulders and never said a word about it. On the morning of March 14, 2006, Harper did what she did every weekday morning. She woke up before sunrise, got her son Mason ready for kindergarten, dropped him off with her sister's family, and drove toward the clinic where she'd worked for nearly 5 years. The morning was cold that day. Wind pressed against the bare trees and the sky looked washed out, as if a storm was waiting. But what Harper did not know was that someone had been watching her. Routine for weeks. Her disappearance began, as these cases often do, with silence. At first it was small she failed to clock in at work. Then her sister Ava called her 3 times with no answer. By early afternoon, panic was already building. Harper had never been the kind of woman to vanish. She had responsibilities, a child, a job, and a little life she built carefully after leaving a difficult marriage 3 years earlier. Around 3 p.m., her sister reported her missing. Deputies searched the roads between her home and her workplace. It was only a 6-mile stretch, but Harper's sedan was nowhere. The usual first assumptions car, trouble, medical emergency, unexpected detour faded quickly. Something was wrong by evening. Harper's co-workers admitted something chilling. The clinic's security camera, positioned toward the staff parking lot, captured her arriving earlier that morning. She stepped out of her car, holding her purse, brushed her hair out of her face, and walked toward the side entrance. Just as she reached the door, someone called out from outside the camera's range. Harper turned her head, paused, and walked back toward her car. Then she disappeared off screen. She never appeared again. Investigators began interviewing people close to her family, neighbors, co-workers. They asked about her ex-husband, Blake Roden, a man with a long history of controlling behavior and sudden anger. But Blake had been living 2 counties away and had a verified alibi. They looked at co-workers. No one stood out. They investigated the few old arguments Harper had with a neighbor over property lines. Nothing serious. 40-8 hours passed. Then 72. Tennessee weather shifted from cold to rainy. With each passing day, the fear in Harper's sister's voice grew sharper. On the 4th day, a fisherman found Harper's sedan near the edge of a levee 2 miles outside town. It was parked neatly, almost too neatly, as if placed with care. The driver's door was locked. Her purse was inside. Her phone was missing. There were small streaks of mud on the car's exterior, but no damage. No signs of struggle, and nothing disturbed inside except for one thing. In the passenger footwell, wedged underneath the floor mat, investigators found a torn piece of fabric. It looked like the cuff of a shirt sleeve, dark, rough, and stained with something brown. Blood testing confirmed it. Belonged to Harper. Forensic officers scanned the entire area with dogs and thermal equipment. Nothing, no footprints. No tire tracks besides her own. The ground had been softened by rain, washing away the evidence investigators needed most. The case turned cold with alarming speed. Weeks passed, then months, then a year. Ava raised Mason alone, doing her best to shield him from the slow, devastating truth settling over the family that Harper might never return. But she never gave up. Every birthday, every anniversary of the day Harper vanished, she called the sheriff's office asking for updates, asking if there was anything new. Anything at all, there never was. The case box was eventually sealed and stacked among dozens of other unsolved files. The detectives who had once been certain they would find answers gradually moved onto other assignments. Harper became another missing person in Tennessee's long history of unsolved disappearances. But there was something different about this one, something investigators had overlooked. In the early days, a pattern. A second case appeared in 2009. A woman named Janelle Poole, age 28, disappeared under near-identical circumstances. She worked in a similar clinic setting, drove a similar route, and vanished in broad daylight. Her car, too, was found abandoned neatly, with a personal item left behind. Then a third woman disappeared in 2011, Kara Benson, 32, same pattern, same quiet, neat disappearance, same lack of evidence. The first investigator to finally connect them was a new hire in 2013, a determined, meticulous detective named Carver Holt. He was only 34 at the time, but he had an ability many older detectives lacked. He noticed what people accepted as coincidence and questioned it. Carver reviewed Harper's case file so many times, he memorized it. He studied the torn fabric found in the passenger footwell and made an observation no one had made before. The stitching on that shirt cuff wasn't common. It looked handmade, not factory produced, with a very specific diagonal pattern used only in certain types of work apparel from the 1990s. It wasn't something easily purchased in stores anymore. He started cross-referencing employment records from the area around 2006, manufacturing plants, maintenance crews, specialized labor jobs. That was when a name surfaced, not a name anyone in Harper's family had ever mentioned, not a co-worker, not her ex-husband, man who lived only a mile from Harper's work. Root, a man who had been arrested twice, both times for following female co-workers home but never harming them physically. Man who had been fired in 2005 from a textile manufacturing job where the workers wore the exact type of shirt that matched the torn cuff in Harper's car. His name was Nolan Creed. He was 44 years old when Harper vanished, but Nolan had disappeared. He moved in 2007, just 1 year after Harper's disappearance, leaving the state abruptly. He left no forwarding address, no active phone number, and no close friends. His landlord reported he moved out with unusual urgency, abandoning furniture, clothing, and one unmistakable detail: he left behind half a dozen shirts with the same diagonal stitched cuffs investigators had overlooked years earlier. Carver felt the first spark of real movement in the case. He reopened Harper's file formally and submitted the torn cuff and the shirts found at Nolan's old rental house for biochemical examination using updated methods unavailable in 2006. Then the breakthrough hit. Inside the cuff found in Harper's car was a tiny fragment of skin tissue so degraded that early labs never identified it. But new DNA amplification technology finally produced a partial profile. It belonged to Nolan Creed. After nearly a decade, they had their suspect. What they didn't yet know, what no one was prepared for, was the horrifying truth that linked Nolan to multiple missing women, all of whom had been written off for years as unrelated disappearances, and Harper's fate was worse than anything her family had ever feared. Detective Carver Holt understood that reopening a decade-old case wasn't just paperwork. It meant stirring up ghosts, painful memories for families, uncomfortable questions for locals, and a renewed sense of fear in a community that had long buried this case under the routine passage of time. But Carver wasn't driven by comfort. He was driven by the cold, steady feeling that something about Harper Linwood's disappearance had always been wrong. And he wasn't letting this suspect slip away. He obtained a warrant to search Nolan Creed's abandoned rental property, even though it had been empty for years and rented to new tenants multiple times since. Most trace evidence was long gone, but Carver wasn't looking for fingerprints or hair. He was looking for patterns, inconsistencies, anything that tied Nolan to Harper's movements. Old property records showed an odd detail. Nolan had added a padlock to the basement door without informing the landlord. The basement itself was nothing special and finished, small, walls lined with metal shelves. But Carver walked through it as if he were walking through the crime scene of an unsolved puzzle. He stood in the room, eyes tracing the concrete floor. Most of it was dusty and undisturbed, but in the far left corner there was a discoloration in the concrete, darker than the rest. The landlord claimed Nolan was always down there late at night, always working on something he never explained. Forensics attempted luminol testing, but after 10 years, the results were inconclusive. Still, Carver's instincts sharpened. He felt certain Nolan had used this house not just as a place to sleep, but as a place to hide. The next step was tracking Nolan. That proved more difficult than expected. Nolan had no social media, no active bank accounts, and no credit trail after 2007. He didn't own property. He never renewed a driver's license. He vanished into the background of the American landscape like dust carried by the wind. But men like Nolan rarely disappeared entirely. They settled somewhere, usually alone, usually far from the place they once called home. Carver contacted regional law enforcement, agencies surrounding Tennessee, Alabama, Georgia, North Carolina, and shared Nolan's outdated photo. 2 weeks passed with nothing. Then a sheriff's deputy in western North Carolina called back with a hit. A man matching Nolan's description had been working on and off in a secluded lumber yard near the Blue Ridge foothills. Paid in cash. No identification required. Kept to himself. Rented a cabin from an elderly man who rarely asked questions. He had been using the name Ray Dixon. Carver drove to North Carolina immediately. When the deputy introduced Carver to Nolan's landlord, an 82-year-old widower, the old man spoke plainly. Ray was polite, quiet, kept to his cabin most nights. He didn't like people visiting him. Carver asked to see the cabin. Inside, the air was stale. A small heater rattled in the corner. A mattress lay on the floor. Shelves lined one wall, filled with neatly folded clothes, mostly work shirts and plain pants. But Carver's eyes were drawn to something else. A box under the bed. Old, dented metal. As soon as he pulled it out, he knew it mattered. Inside the box were newspaper. Clippings. All women. All missing. Harper Linwood's face stared up from one of them. Another clipping was from 2009. The disappearance of Janelle. Paul. Another was from 2011. Kara Benson. And then Carver saw something that made his pulse quicken. A clipping of a fourth missing woman. Someone investigators had never linked to the case. A woman who had vanished in 2003 from a county in Kentucky, 2 hours north of Harper's hometown. Her name was Nora Sewell. Carver realized Nolan's pattern hadn't started in 2006. It had begun earlier, and the women he targeted shared traits: petite, independent, working, living quiet lives that didn't draw attention. Then Carver found the most chilling item in the box, a small, faded photograph of Harper, taken from a distance while she was walking to her car outside the clinic. It was taken before she vanished. Nolan had stalked her, planned for her, waited. Carver took the evidence to the sheriff's department, but before they could issue a full warrant, Nolan was already gone again. He abandoned the cabin sometime in the early hours of the morning, leaving behind only a dirty plate in the sink and an imprint of his body on the mattress. The manhunt began. Deputies, State Patrol, and federal agencies coordinated search efforts. Checkpoints were set up across 2 states. Carver dug deeper into Nolan's past and found something that disturbed him even more. Nolan's employment history in the 1990s included a job that required him to travel between small communities doing textile equipment maintenance. It gave him the ability to study women across multiple areas without drawing suspicion, and something else stood out: every job Nolan ever held ended after incidents involving women, harassment, complaints, trespassing allegations, following co-workers home. But because he never physically harmed them, the complaints rarely resulted in legal consequences. He had been escalating for years. Carver believed that Nolan was responsible for all 4 disappearances, but he still needed definitive proof. So he started re-examining maps: Harper's last known location, the abandoned car, the areas Nolan frequented, and the routes connecting them. One small detail kept drawing his attention: the levee where Harper's car was found. Carver visited the site himself. He walked the perimeter, his boots sinking slightly into the earth. The terrain sloped gently toward water, and thick brush surrounded the area. Something about the placement of Harper's car bothered him. It wasn't abandoned in a hurry. It was set there carefully, tires straight, doors locked. It was staged. Nolan wanted investigators to think she walked away, but the levee had one unusual feature: a narrow maintenance road that stretched behind the brush, hidden unless you were standing right next to it. It was used occasionally by workers, but the general public never noticed it. And Nolan's old rental house was located exactly between Harper's workplace and the levee. The pattern became painfully clear. Harper never made it into the clinic that day on her own that morning. Nolan lured her back to the parking lot. She got close enough to him that he could take her by force without making noise. He brought her to his house. The torn shirt cuff, it was likely ripped during that confrontation inside her vehicle. Carver stared across the empty land and made a decision. He ordered a full excavation of the levee. Surroundings. It took 4 days. On the 5th morning, a forensic technician shouted Carver's name. He ran toward the far end of the maintenance road. They had found something buried roughly 3 feet underground near a dense cluster of roots. Fabric, fragments. A shoe. And then a bone. Human. Carver felt something between relief and devastation. He had always hoped to find answers, but the weight of confirmation hit hard. Tests identified the remains as Harper Linwood, but that wasn't all. Forensics located another gravesite less than 30 yards away. 2 sets of remains were exhumed. One matched Janelle Poole, the other matched Kara Benson. 3 graves, 3 women, all buried along the same hidden stretch Nolan had chosen because he believed no one would ever look there. Carver forced himself to stand over each recovery site, memorizing the locations. He wanted Nolan to see him one day in court. Wanted him to see the names of the women he thought would remain lost forever. But the case wasn't over. Nolan was still missing. A break came from an unexpected direction. A trucker who had seen Nolan's photo on a news bulletin called authorities to report that he picked up a hitchhiker near the Tennessee line 2 nights earlier. The hitchhiker wore a faded flannel shirt and had a nervous, twitchy demeanor. He used the name Ray. He asked to be dropped near a state forest. Carver realized Nolan was running out of places to hide. He drove straight to the forest headquarters and coordinated with search teams. The area was massive, dense wilderness stretching for miles, filled with abandoned trails and long-forgotten hunting cabins. But Carver believed Nolan wasn't trying to escape permanently. Men like him didn't flee to start new lives. They fled to stall the inevitable, and they always returned to familiar habits. A ranger mentioned something that caught Carver's attention. An old service shed deep inside the forest had been broken into recently. Footprints, disturbed dirt, someone sleeping inside. Carver and 2 deputies hiked for nearly 2 hours before reaching it. The shed door hung open. The air smelled of damp wood and stale sweat. Inside, on the ground, was a piece of cloth. Dark, rough, and diagonally stitched. The same pattern as the cuff found in Harper's car. Nolan was close. Closer than anyone expected. The pursuit was entering its final stretch. And Nolan, the man who had stalked, abducted, and buried 3 women, was now cornered in the one place he thought would hide him forever. Carver Holt followed the tracks through the undergrowth with deliberate focus. Every step measured, every sound around him dissected and evaluated. He had spent years hunting violent offenders, but something about Nolan Creed set him on edge more than usual. Maybe it was the silence Nolan carried with him like a cloak, or the way he drifted through life unnoticed until a woman vanished. Men like him blended too well into the background. They smiled politely, nodded to neighbors, and lived quietly while violence festered beneath the surface. The footprints leading away from the shed were fresh. The soil was soft, and the patterned deep heel, shallow toe cut sharply into the ground. Carver could visualize Nolan's movement, fast, urgent, not quite panicked, but rattled. He knew law enforcement was closing in on him. He knew his hiding place had been found. Deputies fanned out behind Carver in a staggered formation. Radios were set to silent. No dogs, no loud voices. This wasn't the kind of pursuit that needed noise. It needed precision. The forest stretched endlessly in all directions, thick with brush and cloaked in a fog that softened the outlines of the trees. But Carver wasn't relying on sight alone. Years of tracking experience taught him to truly listen. A twig snapped somewhere ahead. The sound was faint, nearly swallowed by the wind, but it didn't belong to an animal. It was too sharp, too abrupt. A human misstep. Carver raised one hand, signaling the others to freeze. He moved forward alone, stepping off the trail and into the damp hush of the trees. The air tasted cold, metallic, and the sky dimmed under a canopy of thick branches. Nolan was close. Close enough for Carver to feel the weight of him. Another crack echoed to the right, slightly lower to the ground. Carver's eyes narrowed. Nolan was crouching, moving low, trying to reduce his silhouette. That meant he was scared. And scared offenders made unpredictable choices. Carver stepped deeper into the forest. He found a clearing where the fog hovered, between the trunks like pale smoke. For a moment, everything was still. Too still. Even the wind had paused. Then he saw movement, a figure darting behind a sycamore trunk thin. Hunched shoulders, long hair matted by rain. Nolan creed. Carver didn't yell. He didn't draw his weapon. Instead, he stepped forward and spoke in a steady, controlled voice that carried just far enough. "Nolan, it's over." The figure stiffened. Silence crept between them. Nolan didn't run. He slowly stepped out from behind the tree, his hands raised halfway, fingers trembling. His face was sunken, eyes bloodshot, skin pale and tight around sharp cheekbones. He looked less like a fugitive and more like a man carved hollow by years of secrets. Carver studied him carefully. "You've been running a long time." Nolan's throat bobbed as he swallowed. His voice cracked. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone." Carver didn't flinch. "That's not true. You planned every one of them." Nolan blinked rapidly. "I was lonely." It was such a simple phrase, childish almost, but it carried a weight that churned the air around them. Carver stepped closer. Harper Linwood, Janelle Poole, Kara Benson, and Nora C. You stalked them. You took them. You buried them. Nolan's lips twitched, a small, broken imitation of a smile. "I didn't bury Nora." The words chilled the air. Carver's pulse spiked. "What do you mean?" Nolan lowered his eyes. "I left her where she was. She fought too hard. I didn't get to bury her like the others." Carver felt a tightening in his chest. Nora wasn't one of the remains they had found at the levee. "Where is she?" Carver asked. Nolan hesitated, grinding his teeth in quiet tension. "You won't find her." Carver took another step. "Tell me where she is." Nolan's jaw tightened, eyes shifting toward the thick cover of trees behind him. "You'll see, eventually." Carver made his move. "Drop to your knees." Nolan didn't resist. He lowered himself slowly, hands trembling as he placed them on the ground. When deputies emerged from the fog behind Carver, Nolan didn't look back at them. He stared straight ahead, jaw clenched, as if bracing for something he didn't fully understand. The cuffs clicked around his wrists. The quiet forest exhaled back at headquarters. Nolan was placed in an interrogation room. Carver waited exactly 7 minutes the time he needed to collect himself before walking into the room with the calm professionalism he was known for. Other officers watched from behind the glass, all aware of the gravity of what was unfolding. Carver sat across from Nolan. A table separated them, but the tension made it feel like a vast, cold distance. "You have the right to tell the truth," Carver said. Nolan stared down at his cuffed wrists. "Truth won't help now." Carver leaned forward. "It helps their families." The room fell into a thick silence. Nolan finally lifted his head. "You don't understand. They weren't supposed to die." Carver's voice sharpened. "Explain." Nolan exhaled shakily. "They were mine. I chose them. I watched them. I thought if they understood how much I wanted them near me, they'd stay. But they always tried to leave." Carver felt a muscle tighten in his jaw. "So you forced them?" Nolan nodded. "Sometimes they screamed. Sometimes they cried. I didn't like that part. It made me feel wrong." He paused, his voice turning soft and disturbingly sincere. "But after a while, they got quiet." Carver closed his eyes briefly, not to hide emotion, but to keep his focus sharp. This man wasn't delusional. He was calculated. He fully understood what he had done. Carver continued. "Where is Nora C?" Nolan blinked. "If I tell you, you'll take her away from me again." "She's already gone," Carver said gently but firmly. "But her family deserves to bring her home." Nolan hesitated so long that even the officers behind the glass held their breath. Finally, he whispered, "Old Mill Road, past the river crossing. There's a drainage tunnel. She's inside." Carver's stomach sank. Drainage tunnels were dangerous, narrow, unstable, prone to flooding. If Nora's remains were there, retrieving them would be physically difficult and emotionally harrowing, but it had to be done. Carver stood. "You did the right thing by telling me." Nolan's voice dropped to a hollow whisper. "I didn't do anything right." Within hours, search teams arrived at the location Nolan described. Carver was with them, boots sinking into wet soil as they approached the dark mouth of the drainage tunnel. The air smelled of mud and cold metal. Flashlights cut long beams through the darkness. 20 feet in, they found bones, wrapped in a fragment of fabric that matched the same stitching found in Nolan's box. Nora Sewell had finally been found. The recovery took most of the night, slow and careful. Carver remained silent the entire time, standing guard as if protecting the dignity of the woman Nolan had discarded so carelessly by dawn. All 4 victims had been accounted for. Harper, Janelle, Cara, Nora, families were contacted. Some cried. Some went silent. Some thanked Carver with a gratitude so raw it nearly broke through the professional wall he had spent years building. Nolan Creed stood trial the following winter. The courtroom was full everyday friends of the victims. Retired officers who remembered the original missing person flyers. Neighbors who once waved at Nolan without knowing the truth. Nolan showed little emotion except once, when Harper Linwood's sister walked past him, refusing to look at him. His face tightened, his eyes following her with a peculiar, possessive longing that confirmed everything Carver had believed about him. After 6 days of testimony and 2 hours of deliberation, the verdict was unanimous, guilty on all counts. For life sentences, no possibility of parole. Carver watched silently as Nolan was taken away. Hands cuffed, a hollow figure swallowed by the justice he had evaded for decades. The town of Ashford breathed again. A weight lifted. A long-closed wound finally stitched, but for Carver. The end of the case wasn't triumph. It was grief for Harper, whose kindness made her easy to trust. For Janelle, who planned to move out of state to start fresh. For Cara, who left behind a sister who never stopped searching for her. For Nora, whose disappearance had been buried by time until one man refused to let the truth slip away. Carver walked the levee one final time before closing the case file for good. The wind brushed against the grass. The river moved steadily, indifferent to the secrets it once guarded. Carver stood silently, honoring each woman in his own quiet way. Then he turned away. Justice had come late, but it had come.